So hello everyone, I am Megan Gimber and I work for a conservation charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I am the Key Habitats Officer. So my main focus here is hedgerows, and it is fair to say I am quite hedge obsessed. So I grew up on a rural farm in Devon, although not a farmer myself, and I helped lay my first hedge with my dad at the age of about 7, although I would still very much call myself a beginner hedge layer. This photo is actually of me hiding in a hedge at the National Hedge Laying Championships a couple of weeks ago, which, by the way, is a fantastic day out, and I thoroughly recommend it as a spectator sport to any other hedge enthusiasts. So this talk will be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of hedges. Before I get onto the survey itself, I will give a quick bit of context in terms of hedgerow value, a bit about their management and how this affects their health and how that relates to the way in which we survey them. So I will try to whiz through the first bit quite quickly, as I have seen the amazing list of speakers lined up to give talks as part of this hedge series. I've actually worked with Robert, Nigel and Emma for a number of years as part of HedgeLink, and I'm very much looking forward to joining all of the coming talks in the weeks, which I know will be brilliant. So no matter how hard I try to avoid repeating their talk topics, I'm sure their names will spring up as they've contributed such valuable work over the last few years, and I've learned quite a lot from them as well. But then I promise I will get back to surveying, and I'll focus on what we can do to help hedgerows, and in particular, how surveying can help us directly and indirectly ensure they thrive in the future. Sadly, first, some context. We're facing a triple threat of a biodiversity crisis, an environmental crisis, and a climate crisis. So unfortunately, I can't sit here and say that hedges are going to fix all of these, but I hope to be able to convince you that they're a really good place to start and should certainly be considered as part of our larger arsenal. 70% of the UK is agricultural land, a further 12% is urban. So what we do within both of these is hugely important for our native wildlife. And luckily, hedgerows offer us a number of wins on all of these fronts. So as a conservation charity, we are primarily interested in hedges for their value to wildlife. And this value is incredible. So an example that I like to use is how vital they are to dormice. So we think we've lost about half of our dormouse population since the year 2000. And we know they've gone extinct from about 17 counties in the last 100 years. So it's fair to say they are in a bit of trouble. And as part of our dormouse conservation work, we reintroduce dormice to areas of the country where they have been lost. But before we do this, we need to make sure these new populations are not isolated and that they have good connectivity to other dormouse populations. So this is really, really important. It's actually this connectivity that can allow dormice to maybe inhabit fragments of woodlands that could otherwise be too small to support a viable population. It helps gene flow between dormice in different woodland populations. It allows the movement that can help recover declining populations. And crucially, it allows dormice to migrate to suitable new habitats as and when it becomes available. So sadly, the effect of climate change might make this ability to relocate increasingly important for dormice, especially as they have things like they don't have waterproof fur, so they are particularly vulnerable to certain elements of climate change. So being arboreal creatures, which basically means they don't like scampering across the floor so much, they prefer to travel through branches. It's actually hedges that provide the safest way for our dormouse to cross the countryside. So incidentally, although hedges aren't their primary habitat, we normally consider coppice woodlands to be their primary habitat, hedges are actually capable of sustaining breeding populations of dormice. But to do this, they need to be both large and they need to be species rich and healthy. So that's because dormice eat a variety of food and that changes throughout the year. So they might start eating blackthorn flowers, moving on to insects and ash keys and blackberries and then hazelnuts to fatten up for winter. And what this means is that they need a variety of species growing in a hedge if that hedge is going to fully support them. And what's great about working hedges for dormice is that if we get hedges right for dormice, which are quite fussy little things, we will actually have created a habitat that can support a really broad range of other species at the same time. So that's where we started as a charity, but it's fair to say that our commitment to hedges extends far beyond any species now. So as you'll hear from Rob next week, hedges are extremely valuable for wildlife. In fact, George Eustace recently described them as the single most important ecological building block left in this country. And they're valuable for three main reasons. So firstly, they provide a physical home. So this is things like nesting birds, hibernating hedgehogs, dormice, insects like beetles, butterflies, flies. In fact, it was actually Robert's study that I quote quite a lot when it comes to hedge wildlife. He did a study that counted 2,070 species in just one 85-metre stretch of hedgerow in Devon. 2,070 different species. I just find that absolutely mind-boggling. And considering that was just in one hedge, imagine what they might hold nationwide. So secondly, they're an excellent complementary habitat. So this is one that's not necessarily home, but plays an important role in life. So this could be for food, such as leaves, flowers, berries, insects, or it could be shelter from predators or shelter from the elements whilst out foraging. An example I like to use here, 84% of our farmland bird indicator species make use of hedgerows, whereas actually only 52% of them it's their physical home. The rest actually just use hedges as a complementary habitat for food and for shelter. Thirdly, and importantly, they're used as wildlife corridors. A little bit like I discussed with dormice, they help connect populations that would otherwise be isolated and vulnerable. So this is important for things like flying insects, like butterflies and moths. Many have actually, which use the warmth and the shelter created by a hedge to allow them to fly, but also really important for things like bats and hedgehogs. So hedges are a man-made and man-managed habitat, so it may seem a bit odd that they are so rich in wildlife. But while they aren't what we like a natural habitat per se, in structure, they're what we call an ecotone, which is where more sort of two or more habitats overlap. And in this case, the structure mimics the structure of a woodland edge. So for hedges, we have overlapping elements of woodland, scrub, and grassland. And while they don't replicate any of these habitats fully, it does mean they're capable of supporting many species from each of them, like 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species. And for some species, again, it's greater than the sum of its parts. So some species are dependent on more than one, or maybe even all three of these elements. I think my favorite example of a species that relies on them is a song thrush. So they will sing from the hedge trees. They will nest in that lovely dense structure of the hedge itself. They will feed on snails and worms at the hedge base, especially if you've got really nice wet ditches, before moving on to hedge berries later in the year. So actually, if you look, the closer that you look at the native ecology, the more species you'll find thrive in this woodland edge habitat. Why? So an alternative theory to the closed canopy theory, and this is the one we were all taught in schools, where a squirrel could merrily hop from tree to tree, Land's End to John O'Groats, is that an ancestral state of this island was actually one of a mosaic that did incorporate woodland, but also had glades and scattered trees in areas kept open by large herbivores. And all of this would be alongside plenty of scrub. And all of this would be in flux at different stages of succession. So things weren't neatly sectioned off as they are today. And basically, there'd be loads more of this sort of woodland edge ecotone. And if you think about it, if this is what our ecology has adapted to, it may help explain why those cultural habitats that mimic this structure, so hedgerows, wood pasture, traditional orchards, are all so rich in wildlife, despite being man-made habitats. So if anyone tells you that hedges aren't important because they're a human invention, or that they're not natural or old, just ignore them. And of course, it's not just wildlife that hedgerows benefit. but we're becoming increasingly aware about how valuable they are for both our farming as well as in our battle against climate change. So this poster has a lot more detail of the hedge benefits on the website. So I will just rush through some of this now and skip the detail. There's plenty more detail on the website if you want to go have a look at it. So we call this poster, "What Have Hedgerows Ever Done for Us?" So let's start with livestock. Hedges provide really valuable shelter and shade and diet diversity. They also help with biosecurity. And all of these are important for our high welfare standards, as well as for rearing healthy, profitable livestock. If you aren't interested in livestock, hedges can also benefit crops. So they provide a really good windbreak. They can help us reduce our pesticide use by increasing the population of beneficial insects, such as predatory spiders, ground beetles, parasitic wasps, and hoverflies, all of which can help control pest species. They're also obviously essential in supporting a diverse population of pollinators. So hedges offer pollinator forage throughout the year, not just when crops happen to be in flower, as well as providing areas of uncropped land, which is essential for pollinators to overwinter in. Hedges also reduce soil erosion, and they can play an important role in times of flood. So plant roots, especially things like tree and shrub roots, increase the rate of water infiltration into soil. And this helps the soil act like a sponge and soak up flood water rather than just allowing it to run off the surface. Of course, they also soak up pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, and also things like the sediments in field runoff, helping stop so much of that reaching our rivers. And lastly, of course, they also soak up carbon, which they store in the woody stuff you see above ground, as well as in their roots and in the soil as soil organic carbon. So their contribution to our fight against climate change is rapidly being recognised. So the IPCC recently recommended we extend our hedges by 40%. CPRV have actually launched a fantastic campaign recently calling for the same figure of a 40% increase. And the NFU have also recently highlighted how valuable hedges will be for them in hitting their target of net zero by 2040. So how do we increase the carbon in hedges? Well, luckily, lots of ways. Just a few tweaks of the way we manage our hedges, like establishing more hedgerow trees, filling hedge gaps, and allowing hedges to be bigger on average. They could be doing a lot more of this for us. And that's before we've even got into planting more hedgerows. And then, of course, there are less quantifiable but extremely important benefits, such as our privacy, tourism, our sense of place, and our general well-being. So hedges are obviously a defining feature of our countryside. They have deep, significant cultural and historical importance, and they help tell the story of our farming traditions over the many centuries. So let's move on. Chapter 2, the structure of a good hedge. So a good hedge for wildlife tends to have a diverse shrub layer. So hedges with more plant species have a higher diversity of invertebrates and birds. Partly this is because each plant will have things that specialize on feeding on it, but also because it tends to mean a better year-round availability of food sources because they all flower and fruit at slightly different times of the year. Next up, the size, hedgerow size. So generally, increasing the width and the height of a hedge tends to increase both the diversity and the abundance of wildlife within it. So not only do wider and taller hedges provide more hedge physical volume, but actually it also increases the complexity of the habitat. And larger, more complex hedges provide better shelter for foraging birds and reduced predation for nesting birds. So although hedges should always be managed on a cycle, which will include cutting and rejuvenating, increasing the average size of a hedge within that cycle is a really good idea. Next, we've got structural complexity. So some species, like I mentioned with the thrush, need several hedge features throughout their life cycle. But you can also take this a step further. So given that species have slightly different needs from a hedge, ideally we want to see many different hedge structures represented across a landscape at any one time. which happily is one of the benefits of managing hedgerows on a rotation. Then we've got good connectivity, as I mentioned, with dormice, and a margin at the base of a hedge. So this not only helps protect the roots of the hedge shrubs and hedge trees, but it's actually also brilliant for wildflowers and grasses, which are in turn amazing for birds, small mammals, insects. And some hedges will also have a ditch, which adds even more potential fantastic wildlife habitat. And lastly, I think hedgerow trees, which deserve a few slides to themselves because they are just fantastic. So absurdly valuable for wildlife. Half of the priority species associated with hedges are dependent on hedgerow trees. They provide songposts and territory markers for important bird behaviours. They provide nesting opportunities for birds and bats and more. In a year where a hedge has been cut, and so it won't be providing flowers and fruits, any hedge trees will still provide food for wildlife. Old hedge trees, especially old pollard trees like in these pictures, that you might find maybe more in ancient hedges, provide really valuable deadwood habitat, connecting up all of the other deadwood habitats in our countryside. We've got about 2,000 deadwood dependent insects in this country, and all of them, at least 320 of them are pollinators. So we know that they are a very important, if historically overlooked group. But sadly, we lost a huge number of trees to Dutch elm disease. We are in the process of losing more trees to ash dieback, and we aren't establishing new hedge trees to accommodate these losses. The left-hand side of this shows an old Ordnance Survey map, and beside it, the satellite image of what that land looks like now. So obviously there's a couple of hedges missing there, but I think what is just as striking is the loss of mature hedgerow trees, which are individually indicated. You might see there's some little blobs on that map on the left. And they're almost all gone in the satellite imagery that we see on the right. And in a time where tree planting is all the rage, I think establishing trees in hedgerows seems like a no-brainer. It doesn't take any land out of food production. They form open grown trees, which have several ecological benefits. They could be managed for timber, wood fuel, or additional crop. If you're worried about crop shading, then you can put small tree species in your east-west hedges, and that will reduce the shading impact. And put your larger trees in your north-south hedges, which then have the added benefits of protection from prevailing winds. Of course, you can establish trees in hedges for free, which is marvellous, through natural regeneration. So we can do this just by tagging suitable young candidates and sparing them from the trim. So this has the added benefit of preserving the genetic diversity present in your local tree populations. And genetic diversity is a crucial defense of any species against the unknown threats of the future. So an example I use is while one oak might naturally be better in drought conditions, another may have roots that make it better able to tolerate floods. And a third oak may have some natural resistance to whatever new tree disease may be on the horizon. So certainly, if you ask me, preserving all of this genetic diversity should be an absolute priority. But of course, trees can be planted, and call me an optimist, but when I see gaps in hedges, I always think it's a really good opportunity to plant a new hedgerow tree. One of my husband's ancestors, Admiral Collingwood of the Battle of Trafalgar fame, was actually also famed for spending all of his spare time with a pocket full of acorns in the countryside, planting oak trees with his dog Bounce. Back then, I believe it was a fear of too few trees for shipbuilding, but now we have a similar fear, but for our climate. So perhaps we should all be channeling our inner admiral and getting tree planting. And all this time, hedge trees, provide benefits for wildlife, store carbon, clean the air, reduce our flood potential, and I think adds to the general beauty of our countryside. And actually, the origin story of a hedge can also have a big impact on not only its structure, but also the wildlife that you might find in it. Not all hedges were born equal. So the oldest hedges I know were down in Cornwall, and some estimate these to be up to 6,000 years old, which is mind-boggling if you ask me. Cornish hedges are stone-faced banked hedges, which has a wonderful set of habitat in itself. Then you get some hedges which we call assart hedges, which were field boundaries that were left as the fields themselves were literally cut from the woodland. So these hedges are often fantastically diverse and represent the ancient diversity of the woodlands from which they were cut. So you'll often find ancient woodland indicator plants in assart hedges, and that's not really surprising given they are literally the remnants of very ancient woodlands. Then you get banked hedges in the West Country with woody growth on top and then wildflowers up the bank sides. And then we come to enclosure hedges. So these were planted as part of the land enclosures where common land was hedged in. And this went on for about 500 years, but there was sort of a period of peak enclosure, which was between about 1750 and 1820, where about 200,000 miles of hedging was planted. So these enclosure hedges tend to be single species, mostly hawthorn, planted in straight lines and on the flat, so with no banks. And they tend to be really common around the central areas of the country. So moving on to hedge management, how it affects hedge health. So obviously some hedges are in better shape than others, and the management they see has a huge impact on their capacity to sustain wildlife and their capacity to act as effective wildlife corridors. So the level of fragmentation that you see here obviously makes it near impossible for animals such as dormice to use these hedges for any of their three main uses. And what isn't commonly known, is that hedges are actually best managed on a cycle. In fact, they're what we call a successionary habitat. And managing them on a cycle is the only way they can actually survive in the long term. So this diagram is the hedge management cycle based on the amazing work of Nigel Adams of the National Hedgelaying Society and HedgeLink. And what it shows is that hedgerows are dynamic. They're a living habitat and they need dynamic management based on their life cycle. They aren't just green walls and we can't treat them as such. And it's not possible to keep a hedge at the same point of its life cycle for too long without seeing structural decline. So it might look a little bit complicated at first sight, but what all those purple arrows show is that they show no matter what stage your hedge is in, there is a way of bringing it back into being in a good, healthy condition. So I won't go into too much detail here because Nigel, who's giving a talk, I think in early December, will do a much better job describing and demonstrating this than me in his talk. But I'll just mention a couple of the basic principles because not only do I think it neatly shows how hedges should be managed well, but also what to look for when they're not. And we've utilised these stages and the management advice that it implies as part of the feedback that we generate with our hedgerow surveys. So in the centre here, there's the dense and well-managed hedges, where management might include rotational cutting, incremental size increase, periods of non-intervention, but crucially, always rejuvenation. So hedge laying or coppicing really helps give a whole new lifespan to a hedgerow. It resets that hedge succession, tops up stem density, rejuvenates it from the base, and essentially makes them immortal. The problems come on either side, on the two flanks here. On the left, you see hedges have become overstood. So hedges do require some management, or they eventually all sort of race up. They lose that sort of scrubby growth at the bottom, and they eventually become a sort of gappy line of trees. And on the right-hand side is the opposite. That's the process of over-trimming. So this is trying to keep a hedge in the same box for too long. So again, loses structure at the base, develops a hard knuckle at the trim line, loses stems, and eventually becomes gappy. So personally, I would say these are more of a priority to fix because not only are they disappearing in front of our eyes, but they're not even fulfilling any of the benefits in the meantime, not really to wildlife, not really to the climate, and not really to land managers either. So there's lots of clues that hedgerows give us if we learn to speak their language, that they're in need of a change of management, many of which we pick up with our surveys. So here are a few images but I've made a whole library of these that you'll find on our survey website. That I've made a library called Reading Hedges. And the idea is to help you understand many of these little indicators that a hedge will give us when they're in need for a change of management. So how healthy are our hedges? What do we already know? So first of all, we went through some dark decades of incentivized hedge removal after the war, losing up to about half. But luckily that removal is largely behind us, especially in the agricultural sector. And now we're seeing more hedges planted than ever, which is fantastic. But we do still risk losing many of our hedges through the way they're being managed. The last countryside survey showed that only 31% of our hedges were in good condition with appropriately managed margins. And it's actually dropped down to about 10% in arable land. And in a lot of cases, this is a result of hedges no longer being managed according to their life cycle. And when we look at the trend in species that depend on hedges, it doesn't really paint a pretty picture. So this is the trend for farmland bird indicator species. So remember that 84% of these depend on hedges in some way or another. So similarly, we've lost about 51% of our dormouse population since the year 2000, similar decline in our rural hedgehog population, and sadly other declines across the board. So now we know this isn't all down to hedges. We know there are several other factors contributing to these declines. But given that these species all depend on healthy, well-managed hedgerows, making sure we can provide those could be a well-needed lifeline for some of these species. So I've referred to the last countryside survey a number of times at this point. You may already be aware of it, but just a quick introduction, just in case. It was a comprehensive survey of a countryside, paid for by the government, and it assessed many aspects of habitat health. They were done every decade, and the results of them have been absolutely fundamental to our understanding of hedgerow health. They were an invaluable tool. Unfortunately, the last one was done in 2007, so we are already overdue the next instalment, but it's possible, but they're not likely to be funded in the same way. So it's possible that we might not be getting this quality of data again in the future. From the results of the 2007 survey, which is the last one that they did, plus some anecdotal evidence, we know it's actually the health of our hedges that we need to be worried about. So while it's illegal to remove them without first getting permission, it's not illegal to manage them in such a way that they slowly disappear over time. This is why surveying their health is so very important. So with an uncertain future of the countryside survey, as well as the loss of continued funding to other projects that looked at hedgerow health on a national scale, we decided that hedge health was too important to risk no longer being recorded, especially when the health of our hedges is something to be worried about. So we have made not one, but two different hedgerow surveys. Firstly, our Great British Hedgerow Survey. So this is our main survey. It's aimed at volunteer groups, wildlife groups, parish groups, hedge groups, etc. Each survey takes about 20 minutes to do. It needs to be done when hedges have leaves on them because it does count hedge species. And it provides us with really high quality data about hedgerow health. So this data at the national level will show us hedge trends, which can help us direct our conservation efforts, as well as all the messaging that we share. So when added to the survey website, each hedge gets tailored feedback about not only the health of the hedge, including a blow-for-blow account of everywhere you might have lost points, but also management advice based on Nigel's hedge management cycle. So we didn't need to reinvent the wheel to do this, but we actually built on the standard methodology for hedgerow surveying, which was developed alongside HedgeLink and DEFRA and was a brilliantly well thought out survey. So what we were able to do was simplify the methodology to make it more accessible without compromising the integrity of the survey method. We also adopted the DEFRA hedgerow database and aimed to be the main central repository for hedgerow health data nationally. Again, having all of this data in one place can help us understand hedgerow health at a national scale. So it helps us tailor our conservation work, understand where we are and what we need to be doing or promoting to make sure we have a thriving network of hedges. And this is what the survey looks like in paper. One side is about the structure of hedge, so the height, the width, its base canopy. And the other side looks at the species and the trees in the hedge. And this might be a bit difficult to see because it'll probably be quite small on your screen. But this is an example of the feedback that it gives. So at the top there's a score and some general broad brush advice. And below there's 3 separate scores based on the structure, biodiversity and connectivity scores of the hedge. Again, as well as a blow-for-blow account of every place that a hedge lost points and what you might be able to do about it. So we were even able to tie in Nigel's hedge management cycle and give feedback about the most appropriate management options for each hedge based on the results of each survey. And the second one that we've done is actually a hedgerow app called Healthy Hedgerows. And this is a rapid assessment app. So this one is actually designed for farmers and land managers, and it's a more simplified version of the survey still. So while it doesn't give any feedback about the health of a hedge, it actually just uses 6 questions. So it's quite quick and simple to use. And it gives just instant management advice for each hedge surveyed. So really it's designed as a simple tool to help any landowner interested in transitioning back to that hedgerow management life cycle and give them the tools to do that much more simply. So this was developed as part of Close the Gap, which is one of the many Green Recovery Challenge Fund projects. I'd say it takes hardly any time to do each survey. It can be done in winter because you don't have to look at any hedge species. And while it doesn't give us such detailed data for us to look at, the main aim of this one is to get the management advice out there. So for anyone that might be interested in doing some hedge surveying, I've got a few general hedge surveying top tips. So first of all, definitely read the guidance before going out. Things may seem obvious when you read them on paper, but they are less so when you have a troublesome hedge in front of you. If you're doing group work, make sure you don't double up on surveys, but divide up a local map between you and have a coordinator of the project that can help make sure that the hedge surveys aren't doubled. When you add your surveys to the website, you actually drop a pin on an aerial map at the start and at the end of each hedge. So having a location reference for each hedge survey is essential. What I like to do is I like to take a paper map out with me and I write a reference on the paper map and on the top of the survey form, and that helps avoid confusion. And then I'd also say take a stick. So I have a telescopic stick, which I think was an old telescopic paint roller with permanent marker lines sort of drawn on. It's great for measuring hedgerow height, but also there's almost no way of measuring the width of a hedge without a stick. Trust me, I have tried. It's impossible and occasionally painful. I'd also say make sure you're familiar with the different hedgerow structures and their descriptions, because this is really important to surveying. Sometimes if you forget your measuring stick, you can sub in a human to measure the height. I'm lucky enough that my husband is exactly 6 foot, which means he often gets used as a ruler in my hedge photos. But unfortunately, even this doesn't help measure the width of a hedge, so do remember to take a stick out with you. So here's me, firstly, surveying all of the hedges on one of our nature reserves on the Isle of Wight. The survey correctly recognised that one of our hedges was in quite a desperate need of rejuvenation and recommended that we did some hedge laying. So bottom and up to the right of the screen, that's me and my colleague Nida laying this hedge with a group of fantastic volunteers in the following January. And here is some of the incredible regrowth from that hedge in just one season. So we took the opportunity when laying this hedge, not only to plant up some of the thin areas, but also to leave some of the stems as new hedgerow trees. The red bit on the left here is a hedgerow hawthorn, and we left that in to establish a new hedgerow tree. And there's another one just on slightly to the right of this frame. So we will trim this hedge to begin with to help develop that sort of wonderful, thick, dense structure. And these extra hedge trees will help ensure that there's blossom and berries even on the years that this hedgerow does see a trim. So there are some supporting materials on the website. Like I mentioned, there's photo galleries that show you different stages of hedgerows. So they show you what to look out for, how to recognise the different stages in their life cycle, and also how to read the features of a hedge, both to assess its health, but also to understand how past management might have worked on it, and how to read those little indicators that a hedge gives us to tell us when it's in need of a change of management. So I hope I've convinced you that hedges are incredible, that they're fascinating and they are valuable beyond measure. But what now? So how can we all help? I would say if you own a hedge, take a closer look at its structure, look at its health, and make sure that you're managing it dynamically according to its life cycle. I would also say, show off any amazing hedges that you have. Make all of your neighbours jealous with the best, biggest, most bountiful hedges you can grow. Hedges are probably the most visible aspects of the way we manage our land, but our pride in them doesn't need to come from their neatness. Instead, we can boast about the berries that they're producing, or the flowers that they grow, or take pride in all of the other things that they do for us and for wildlife. But if you don't own a hedge, there's obviously still ways that you can directly help. So of course, I will say, get out and get surveying. There are fantastic groups up and down the country already working alongside farmers and landowners, providing these health checks and sharing the resultant management advice with landowners. Another thing you can do is tag young hedge saplings to spare them from the trim. So I was chatting to someone recently who said he'd noticed that all the trees in the hedges near him were old, and he was worried that trimming regimes weren't allowing for new hedgerow trees. So he chatted to his local farmer down the pub, who completely agreed. So this chap is now marking potential young hedgerow saplings with colourful sticks, and the farmer has instructed the trimming contractor to avoid them. So that I personally think that's a simple and elegant solution that benefits everyone. I recently spoke to another amazing individual who wrote to her local council to ask them whether they were able to update their hedge trimming regime in light of the climate and wildlife crisis. And now they're working together to put a more dynamic plan in place for their local council managed hedges. Amazingly, councils do still get complaints about how tidy they want hedges. So it is valuable to provide a balancing narrative. And also, if you have the space, think about setting up a community nursery. So planting saplings from locally collected tree seeds, you're making sure that some of that gorgeous and very essential genetic diversity is maintained. So our hedges are our Noah's Ark of tree genetic diversity. And these can then be, with the help of farmers or community groups, can be used to fill hedge gaps or establish new trees. Lastly, I would say, just go out and look at your hedgerows, see what you can see in them, look at the plants, the insects, the birds. I guarantee you, with a greater appreciation of your local hedges, you will probably find yourself coming up with your own new and imaginative ways of helping. Okay, so our turn, what are we doing to help? Well, we created these 2 surveys to collect information for us to understand what's happening at a national level, but also to help deliver valuable feedback about the condition, the health and management advice. As the adage goes, you can't improve what you don't measure. So understanding how healthy our hedges is critical to helping us understand what we can do to help them both now and in the future. So this data helps us direct our conservation work, our messaging, but also the policy that we seek. We're also talking directly to farmers and other groups that directly manage hedgerows across the countryside through leaflets, talks, farm walks, and more. We work within partnerships. So at the moment on a partnership called Close the Gap with some absolutely fantastic partners, but also in partnership with HedgeLink, which is an organisation that brings together everyone interested in hedgerows to share the knowledge, the ideas, to inspire, and to work with farmers to conserve and enhance the hedgerow heritage. So this can include working on research, sharing information, collaborative projects, and looking at the policy that affects our hedges nationally. So I think the future looks good for hedgerows, personally. They've been with us in some form since we think about the Bronze Ages, at least, and they've weathered some pretty turbulent times in that time. Last century wasn't the first time, and I doubt it will be the last, that politics has had a big impact on our hedges. They've seen land enclosures, riots, uprisings. The history of hedges is absolutely fascinating. But we're now recognizing how many different benefits they bring us, and on so many different levels. So there really is a growing interest and a buzz about making sure that they thrive. We've actually got a lot to thank farmers for when it comes to our hedges. As I mentioned, they are a man-made and they're man-managed habitat. And it's actually centuries of farming that's led to this wonderful network of hedges that we see today. So I just think it's amazing, really, to realize that the reason that we have so many ancient hedges is thanks to an unbroken chain of care, management and periodic rejuvenation. Each hedge carefully laid, perhaps once or twice in a generation, through their many centuries. And some of them really are incredibly old. Hedges are essentially made immortal by the skills and by the management passed from generation to generation. But we have to recognize that they will only survive if we offer them similar care and consideration going forward. So this poster here shows the history of hedgerows in a little bit of detail, not much. But I also think it's time that we start looking forward. So the privilege of caring for them and the responsibility of ensuring that they have a healthy future now falls to us, because we're the ones that write the next chapter of their history. Thank you.
There we go. Oops. Brilliant, thank you, Megan. That was absolutely fantastic. I've had a few questions coming in, which I will direct your way. I'll also now open it up so that if you want to turn your camera on to everybody listening, then now is the time to do so that we can see you all and answer questions. And yeah. In the meantime, I will go for it, Megan, with the first question that came in. Ian, hello, has answered, his question is, how much do you feel that the farming community are buying into planting and managing hedgerows, particularly crop farming? Do the grants cover the perceived lost income from expanding crop growing areas and the time required for proper management of those hedgerows after planting? Do you feel?
It's quite a big question. I'll address the beginning part of that first. I'm working with a huge number of farmers that are interested in re-establishing lost hedgerows. So some of them are doing this with external support, some with government support, some from support with charities and people like the grant schemes that are available. Some of them are doing it off their own back because they see the advantages to their own farming. I've actually been to a number of farms recently that have been going all out planting new hedgerows, especially re-establishing ones that they knew had been lost in recent decades. So I do think there is optimism there, because we are understanding how valuable they are for our farming, not just for wildlife. You know, you don't have to give two hoots about wildlife to see the value in hedgerows nowadays, which is brilliant. In terms of whether the support is adequate going forward, it's very difficult to tell. So we're just about to change the way that farmers are supported. And the early indications, I would say, of the sustainable farming incentives, there are elements of that which I think look really positive. So they include incremental increase for the size and the width of hedges, which is fantastic. So that keeps them sort of moving, it keeps them slightly more dynamic. But then there are a few elements that I think may need a little bit more work. So I think it would be really nice to see hedge rejuvenation integrated into the way we support farmers to manage hedges. And I don't think that's that's the case under what we're seeing at the moment. But it's really difficult to tell because we've only really seen the first glimmer of what the new schemes are going to be like. So it's very difficult to say what's going to be in the second tier of that, and to what extent the funding will be adequate isn't clear at the moment.
Sure. Brilliant. I would like to add Little Wild Farms response as well, that have said, us livestock farmers have always valued our hedgerows. Planting and laying happens quite regularly from my experiences. I just thought I'd add theirs in.
And you can see that across the countryside, actually. If you go to an area that's purely arable, the hedges are often in poor condition, whereas areas where you've got small farms, mixed farms, and livestock farming tends to be the areas where you've got much better hedgerow condition. A lot more effort goes into them, and I think, you know, partly the values of hedges for livestock are a lot more obvious. The sort of shade, the shelter, very, very obvious benefits for livestock. I think we've got a bit more work to do to demonstrate the values of hedges for crop land. But they do have their values, and there is some fantastic research going on to show that at the moment. So, you know, University of Reading have done some amazing research on hedges as reservoirs of pest predators, and how important they can be in reducing the incidences of pest outbreaks. And I think that's particularly pertinent at the moment when we're looking at which pesticides we can and can't use, and which ones work anymore. So I think that's a really interesting approach, as well as for things like pollinator species as well, because, as I said, it's not just about providing flowers all year round, it's also about having an area of uncropped land for pollinators to overwinter in. And that often goes unnoticed, actually. All of our pollinators need somewhere to live over winter. They can't do it in ground that's been ploughed and cropped. So having things like boundaries like hedges offers all of those sort of niches that all of our different pollinator species need to really survive the winters.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I've got a hedgerow identifying question. I'll summarise. Do you mean that you can't identify hedgerow species without leaves? Or then they've put, or were you talking about the understory? Not quite sure.
Okay, I think this relates to the surveying. So the two different surveys, one of them can be done in the winter because you don't have to look at the hedgerow species. That's the app, the rapid assessment one aimed at farmers. The Great British Hedgerow Survey does look at hedgerow species, so it is better to do it when things are in leaf. You can identify species based on the twigs and based on the buds. It can be quite difficult. I would say, even if you're an expert in doing that, it's still better to look at a hedge when it's got leaves on, because there will be things that you miss. And we do looking at the abundance of a species in a hedge. So we look at the top 5 species and their sort of relative abundance. And that's very much more difficult to do when you're just doing stick ID and analysis. So yeah, definitely worth doing it when it's got leaves on if you're doing a full survey.
Yeah, it makes it much easier. Cool. Somebody's asked, Luki has asked, can multiple people enter data for a surveying project, e.g. lots of volunteers in a parish survey?
Absolutely. So the website has the facility for a hedgerow coordinator, so a project coordinator, to add a project description, and that gives it a title. And basically anybody that might be working towards that project can allocate their surveys to that project, and that means the project admin can see all of the data that comes in that's been attributed to that project.
Brilliant, good to know. I've got hang on, just gone down there. Oh, I've just lost it. There we go. Somebody has asked about when you've said about adding the hedgerow trees. Sergio has come out with adding some Christmas trees to hedgerows might be a good idea to feed the surrounding lands with perennial leaves. Just wondered if you wanted to come back on that.
We've got plenty of other species as well that keep their leaves on during winter. Holly's a great one, actually. Holly, so I'm from down in Devon, and we've got like fantastic mixed species hedges down there. And sometimes I get told that we can't have too many trees in our hedges because it shades out the hedge itself. That can be true, but there are things you can do to alleviate it. Down in Devon, you often get quite a lot of things like holly and hazel planted underneath the big tree species, like our hedgerow oaks and our hedgerow pollards, because things like holly and hazel are a little bit more shade tolerant. But holly itself also obviously keeps its leaves on through winter, so adds an extra level of sort of shelter through winter as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I think the native species are usually considered as better for wildlife as well. So that's, yeah, really good. Somebody, I keep losing it. That's it. Somebody has asked, interesting question. What do you know about combining solar farms with new hedgerows? Is there anything like that?
I would say nothing specifically. I have seen a number of new hedgerows planted in solar farms, but I'm afraid that's generally from a car or a train window. What I've seen so far is that it's certainly an adequate place for them if they're managed well enough not to shade the solar too much. But I don't have anything specific on that sort of that marriage, I'm afraid.
No, that's fair enough. I've got one here. Please, could you expand on hedgerow trees and a concern in the long term of the trees taking light and nutrients from the hedge? The woodland trusts require a tree every 6 meters. How will this work in the long term, creating a healthy hedge? Will it impact it?
Oh, there's so much to talk about here. Hedgerow trees are my particular passion, so I could do a whole nother talk about them if I had a chance. I would say personally, for me, having them at regular intervals isn't necessarily the most desired outcome. Partly because sometimes having a tree on its own means it can develop that wonderful full crown of an open grown tree. Sometimes having a couple together creates different microclimates within them. Having too many trees and hedges can make the hedge management a bit more difficult. So overshading a hedge can have implications. That's definitely true. I've got a hedge down in Devon. It's 45 meters long. And it's got 13 mature oaks in it, which are enormous. They're all about sort of 100, 200 years old. Some of them are even older than that. And it makes managing that hedge a bit more difficult. The hedge underneath it is mostly elm. It's got some holly, it's got a bit of hazel in it, it's got a bit of hawthorn as well. And we find that the hedge gets leggy a lot quicker. So it just means that the cycle in which we need to rejuvenate that hedge is shorter, because it gets a bit tall and leggy, we lay it again, have it nice and dense and neat. Or as neat as we can do with my hedge laying. As I said, I'm definitely still a beginner hedge layer. But yeah, it can have implications on how you manage your hedge and how difficult it is to keep that hedge in a hedge shape. In terms of shading, if you are concerned about hedgerow shading, you can actually just choose smaller hedgerow species to grow as trees. So having a couple of hedgerow hawthorns, if you lay your hedge and just leave a couple of those hawthorns as new hedgerow trees, they're not going to get huge. They're not going to overshade the rest of the hedge. But what they do is, again, provide blossom and fruit on years where the hedge is cut. So I think, because obviously most of our hedgerow plants actually only flower and fruit on second year wood. So if you cut them every single year, you tend to be cutting off all of that flowering and fruiting potential. And I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, so I'm going to have to sort of half make this stat up, but I'm pretty sure it was something like a mature hawthorn tree in a hedge can provide the same amounts of blossom and fruit as 200 meters of annually trimmed hedge. So don't quote me on that sort of 200 meters, but it is something akin to that. So actually, even if you just have a small hedge tree like a hedgerow hawthorn, it can still work wonders for wildlife. But equally, things like rowan, there's a number of native hedgerow tree species that won't get too big, won't do so much shading if shade, hedge or crop shading is a concern.
Perfect. Somebody has also actually asked about, similar to the shading, that they've been told that it can affect their crops because there's a drought boundary next to the hedge. Could you comment on that? Because they've started to keep their hedges smaller with that information.
It can do, yeah, it can do. And especially those huge, great hedgerow oaks, they can take quite a lot of moisture out of the soil. Equally, I have seen them in times of drought. The shade that they cast can be the only place where you see green crops in a field, because sometimes, you know, obviously we're seeing droughts, but we're also seeing we're seeing quite a lot of effects of climate change, so heat waves and stuff. And sometimes the shade can actually help with that as well. They can also help do things like reducing the wind speeds in a field, which can actually stop so much water getting whisked away. So they can have other benefits with the water. It's not quite as clear cut, and it's quite a complex sort of system when we're talking about sort of trees, hedges, and water in the field. Yes, but they can do. And I think things like having a good hedgerow margin, which there's sort of funding for under quite a lot of the agricultural schemes. And again, also choosing which hedgerow tree species to have and where they're put is really wise. But yeah, they're not suitable in every situation, and I'm certainly not saying we should have as many oak trees as my silly hedge down in Devon that's got far too many.
Yeah, perfect. That's the thing. Anything's better than nothing, isn't it? That's the point. Absolutely. Okay, so then I've got Emma wanting to know from Derbyshire, how do we join in with encouraging a hedge planting scheme? We have many stone walls, but I'd love to get involved with more hedge planting.
Well, luckily there's a huge amount of interest and buzz about hedge planting at the moment. So pretty much everywhere you look, or everywhere I look, there's hedgerow planting schemes to get involved with. I think CPRE have a number of them in the various CPRE branches. So definitely look at your local CPRE branch and see what they're doing. Certainly, I know that there are also the grants available for community hedge planting. I know the Tree Council have got several grants. I would say have a look at the local branches of your organizations similar to that, and they'll probably be hedge planting. And this is the time that they're going to be doing it as well. Hedges get planted over winter, so we've got a good few months of hedge planting this season ahead of us.
To add to that, obviously there's the Queen's Green canopy that's currently in full flow, and hedgerows very much can be a part of that. They're actually a really important part of that, particularly around Oxfordshire. So yeah, okay. Gosh, these questions are coming thick and fast. I don't know if we're going to have time to answer all of them. Someone's put, if you use the app to survey the local hedges as a group, do you have access to the survey as a whole group after it's gone?
So the app and the website with the Great British Hedgerow Survey, they're actually connected. So any data that you put on the app will go to the website. So if you've all got logins for that, similarly with the project admin, you can do the same with the app data. It's slightly a bit more complicated. You've got to allocate the data to the project once the data's got to the website rather than the app, but it is still possible. Yeah.
Okay. I've got from Amanda, any tips on how to determine who owns a boundary hedge when owners on neither side know who it belongs to?
And it's not on the deeds.
And it's not on the deeds.
Conventionally, it's who has the ditch, but if your hedge doesn't have a ditch, then I wouldn't know how to answer that if it's not on the deeds. Conventionally, if you've got the ditch on your side, that means the hedge is generally yours. I think I've got that the right way around. But there aren't that many, not all hedges are ditched, so that doesn't really help, and it's not foolproof anyway. So I would say I'm not sure if it's not on the deeds, I'm afraid.
Fair. And then we are actually nearly through them all. Where are we? Oh, someone has commented on the solar thing. Solar 2, create solar farms and install surrounding hedgerows, as well as seeding with wildflowers. So there you go. That does happen. Where are we? No. So, okay. I think the last one was, could you prioritize the survey questions? What's sort of the most important bit to answer when surveying a hedge? Is there a most important bit?
That's a difficult one to answer because quite a few of them relate to each other. So, for example, when I go out surveying, the first thing I look at in a hedge is the hedge base. Because if your hedge is becoming overstood or if your hedge is becoming over trimmed, it shows at the base, quite early on. So the base of the hedge will start to lose that cover. It'll start to become what we call leggy. The stem density will decrease, and you'll see it first at the base of a hedge. So I'll always look at the base canopy and look at the stems in there. But I'd say it's difficult to prioritize one question because so many of them are linked. So when we're looking at the base canopy of a hedge, when I'm looking at the data in particular, I will also look at what is on the other side of that hedge. So if there's maybe sheep farming, then you may think that the hollow base of the hedge could either be from the way it's being managed, or it could be because it's being eaten by the sheep in the field. So things like, is there a fence and what's the field use really helps us sort of contextualize things like that base canopy data. So difficult to pick one or two main points from the hedge survey. I would say we whittled it down to 6 questions for the Healthy Hedgerows app. So from my point of view, they are important ones when you're looking at the different ways that you can manage a hedge. So that's the structure based on Nigel's hedgerow life cycle and those images that I showed earlier. The height and the width, and again, they can help contextualize the structure and understand, whether the right one's been picked. We look at the base canopy again to see whether a hedge might need rejuvenation. We look at the gaps. So gaps generally are a good indicator that a hedge needs a change of management, because you tend to only get gaps in a hedge if it's either being overstood or it's being over trimmed, or if there's something in the management that's causing that hedge to be in decline. So gaps are a really good indicator. And also hedgerow trees. So for me, those are the 6 questions that I think we whittled it down to for.
Well done.
But I couldn't whittle it down any further. 6 is as few as I can take it down to.
That's fair. Now I think we are probably on our last question. I'm not sure if some more have come in, but the one that I've had further up was, is there anywhere that people can access the data on lost hedgerows, like that image you showed of the healthy hedge and then the satellite image? Is there anywhere that people can go for that information? So
it comes with a warning because it's completely addictive. But that comes from a website called the National Library of Scotland. I think it's called the National Library of Scotland. I can post a link to it hopefully in the notes in a minute. But it's a website that basically allows you to see maps side by side, and you can choose on a drop down on one side of the page which map you want to see. So you can go back to the old Ordnance Survey maps of the 1880s, which are my favourite ones. And then on the right hand side, it shows you the aerial footage. And if you move one map, the other one moves as well. So you can see exactly what's going on there. There's even one layer down in the southwest, sorry, I don't think it will cover Oxfordshire, that shows individual hedgerow trees. So that's one of the ones I showed earlier in the talk. And it shows like individual mature hedgerow trees, and you can actually see the maps side by side and see which trees were there in 1880s and which ones are there now, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. But it's quite a heartbreaking website because if you look at it, you will often see quite how much has changed in quite a short amount of time. So you can see right from the 1880s maps to the sort of maybe 1950s maps, and then the satellite imagery now, and see maybe how much towns and villages have expanded, how many hedgerows have been lost, orchards have been lost, and these features. I find it fascinating when I'm going out on a walk somewhere I've never been, because you end up seeing features and you go, oh, I wonder whether that's something on the old maps. And so I've got a direct link to it on my phone. But again, it is quite an addictive website. I think I put the link on one of the slides. But I normally Google side-by-side maps, and it's the first thing that comes up on Google if you Google side-by-side maps.
Perfect. That sounds really good. I've got a little discussion here going on, I think. We've got Little Wild Farm has said about hedge planting being expensive and needing to erect a livestock proof fence each side to protect it. And then someone else has put what can be used instead of plastic tree guards. So there's a few practical points there. And I think that's it.
Okay. I'll tackle the expensive. It is expensive. It's actually at the moment, things like fencing is increasingly expensive, so it is becoming more and more expensive to plant hedges. Oh, thank you. Someone's put up the side-by-side maps link. I do know of farmers that are willing to do this off their own back, because they see the value in it. I think there's a lot of interest around regenerative farming at the moment, especially with livestock, and maybe a move away from set stocking, but having livestock moved around a lot more and giving the pasture time to recover. So there's an awful lot of people looking into reinstating hedges to decrease their field size and do this. And I've spoken to two farmers very recently who are doing this for exactly that reason. They say they're finding it much easier to manage their stock in this sort of regenerative way of farming, which is really, really very positive. That obviously won't go for everyone, and the price of planting a hedge, is getting more expensive. Hopefully this again will be covered in the new agricultural schemes as and when they come out. I believe that will again be in the capital grants that they give. So hopefully the details of that will be enough to cover the installation and the protection of the hedges as well. In terms of the plastic tree guards, this is a really interesting one. There are lots of people doing work on this at the moment. So there's not only interest in looking at alternatives to plastic, so things like ones made of wool, some made of cardboard. Some of these at the moment, they do look like an expensive alternative. But if they do fully compost and break down, then that does also save quite a lot of time going in and taking off the brittle plastic guards, which is an absolute horror of a job for anyone that might have had the misfortune of having to do that. They sort of shatter and splinter as you're trying to get them off. But also just to reduce the amount of plastic that we're putting in. I would say there's going to be advice coming out about this quite soon, I believe, through the Tree Council and HedgeLink, looking at maybe whether the guards are actually essential in your area at all. So in a lot of places they are completely essential because the browsing pressure is too high, and you'd obviously lose too many whips if you didn't. But in some areas you can get away without using them. So I've planted a hedge 2 years ago now and haven't used the spirals, and I've been absolutely fine. But I'm lucky enough to live in an area that doesn't have many rabbits or hares to nibble them. I'd say a bit of light browsing on hedge whips isn't actually too bad. So what most of our hedge species do, because they're all in the Rosaceae family, or most of them are, and most plants in Rosaceae, they respond to like the growing tips being nibbled off by essentially doing like a pufferfish impersonation and putting on loads of branching growth further down the stems. And this actually can help create that sort of dense, thick structure to a hedge. So it's not terrible if there's a bit of light browsing, but of course, if the browsing pressures are too high, then too many whips are lost and it is damaging. So hopefully there'll be guidance coming out quite soon to try and understand in which cases and in which scenarios you can get away without using guards at all. And of course, a lot of the research that was done to tree guards was done sort of with more of a forestry sector idea in mind, where you want sort of tall, straight trees with nice and clean stems, which actually isn't the case for our hedges. So there could be some value in revisiting the research with that. And as I said, there's a lot of people sort of looking at that at the moment. So hopefully in the near future, we'll have a bit more evidence and some clearer guidance on that.
Perfect. So that was the hedge link, and what was the other one you mentioned? Just so people are clear where to go for information when it comes out.
It was hedge link with the Tree Council.
With the Tree Council.
Yeah.
Perfect. No, that's spot on. I've had Sergio has asked about, but that's talking about agroforestry, I think, which is a whole nother talk that we could do.
Yep. It can be considered agroforestry. It's utilising trees in agriculture. So they can be seen. Yeah.
He said he doesn't, he's used to, by the sounds of it, agroforestry of crops and amongst forests, rather than, as he's put it, planting and farming under open sky. So he doesn't quite understand the sort of fence and hedge like concept. But I think there's room for that, but that's a whole other talk. So maybe we can't quite go into that now. And that we've had, I don't know if you're looking at the chat, we've had lots and lots of people saying what a fantastic talk that was. So thank you a lot. That's been absolutely brilliant. Lots of people saying how interesting and excellent it is. So thank you. I think might pass over to Roselle to wrap up, unless